The King of Cocaine, Pablo Escobar, a story of power, terror, and ruin. The shadow before the storm. The afternoon sun beat down on the terracotta rooftops of Medellin, casting long shadows across the Los Olivos neighborhood. It was December 2nd, 1993, one day after Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria had celebrated his 44th birthday in hiding, and the walls were finally closing in. Somewhere in that middle-class barrio, in a modest house that bore no resemblance to the palaces he once commanded, the most wanted man in the world was making a fatal mistake. He was talking too long on the phone. For 16 months, Pablo Escobar had been a ghost, moving through the city that had once worshipped him as both king and savior. He never stayed in one place for more than 2 nights. He traveled in taxis, disguised, anonymous among the people who had once chanted his name. The man who had built an empire worth billions, who had owned 19 residences in Medellin alone, each with its own helipad, who had commanded armies of sicarios and bent presidents and judges to his will, was now reduced to this desperate existence. He had burned $2 million in cash just to keep his daughter warm during a cold night on the run. The money meant nothing anymore. Survival was all that remained. But on this Thursday afternoon, desperation got the better of caution. Pablo needed to hear his son's voice. He needed to know his family was safe. So he picked up the phone and he talked, and the seconds stretched into minutes. And somewhere across the city, in a room full of electronic surveillance equipment provided by the United States government, technicians watched their screens light up with coordinates. They had him. Within the hour, search block commandos surrounded the house on Carrera 79B. Colombian National Police, trained by Delta Force operators and armed with intelligence from the CIA and DEA, moved into position. On nearby rooftops, snipers took their places. The net that had been drawing tighter for more than a year was about to close completely. Inside the house, Pablo Escobar knew. He had always known it would end this way. For all his power, for all his wealth, for all the blood he had spilled and the terror he had inflicted, he had always understood that his choices had narrowed to 2 outcomes, the only 2 outcomes a man like him could expect when he wages war against the world. A grave in Colombia or a cell in the United States. Those were the options. Those had always been the options. He chose the grave. When the police burst through the door, Pablo and his last remaining bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as El Limón, fled toward the back of the house. Gunfire erupted. El Limón went out the window first, dropping onto the lower roof, running barefoot across the hot tiles. He fell to gunfire before he made it 20 meters. Pablo followed, carrying a pistol, his full beard and long hair giving him the appearance of a man, much older than his 44 years. He ran across that rooftop as bullets whipped past him, as the police closed in from all sides, as the helicopters circled overhead, and the city he had built and broken watched his final moments unfold. Confiscated his leg. Another hit his torso. He stumbled but kept moving, kept fighting, because Pablo Escobar had never surrendered to anything in his life, and he was not about to start now. But there was nowhere left to run. The roof ended. Beyond it was only air and the long fall to the street below. Behind him, the police were closing the distance. In his hand, the pistol felt heavy, impossibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of every choice he had ever made. Then came the final shot. It entered near his right ear and exited through his skull, and Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, the narco-terrorist who had brought a nation to its knees, the man who had once been worth $30 billion, collapsed onto the red tiles. Blood pooled beneath him as the police surrounded his body. Within minutes, they were posing for photographs, smiling as they stood over his corpse, their boots inches from his lifeless face. One of them would later claim he had fired the killing shot. Another would say it came from a sniper. Others whispered that Pablo had done it himself, that in those final seconds He had chosen his own terms one last time, had put the barrel to his head and pulled the trigger rather than let them take him alive. The truth of who fired that fatal bullet remains disputed to this day, lost in the chaos and the smoke and the competing claims of glory. Punished, that matters. The question that echoes through the decades since that December afternoon is not who killed Pablo Escobar. The question is how a man born in poverty, in a country torn by violence and inequality, rose to become one of the richest and most feared criminals in human history. How did a teenage car thief transform himself into an empire builder who controlled 80% of the cocaine entering the United States? How did he amass wealth that dwarfed the budgets of nations, build private armies that rivaled government forces, and create a legend so powerful that even in death, even after all the horror and devastation he caused, some people still speak his name with something approaching reverence? This is that story. It is not a story of heroism, because there are no heroes here. It is a story of ambition without limits, of wealth without conscience, of power that corrupted absolutely until nothing remained but ruin. It is a story about what happens when one man believes he is above all law, all morality, all consequence. It is a story written in blood across the history of Colombia, carved into the grief of thousands of families who lost loved ones to bullets or bombs, or the simple bad luck of being in the wrong place when Pablo Escobar's empire required another sacrifice. And it begins, as all such stories must, in a place far removed from rooftop gunfights and surveillance helicopters and the cold machinery of international manhunts. It begins in a small town in the Colombian highlands, in the humble circumstances of a family that had no idea their third child would one day hold their entire nation hostage to his rage. The boy from Envigado. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1, 1949, in Rio Negro, a small town in the Antioquia department of Colombia, high in the Andean mountains where the air was thin and the earth was rich with coffee and coca. He was the third of 7 children born to Abel de Jesus Escobar Echeverri and Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio. His father worked as a farmer and watchman, tending to cattle and land that belonged to others. His mother was an elementary school teacher, a woman of some education and dignity in a community where such things mattered. By the standards of rural Colombia in the late 1940s, the Escobar family was not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They had food on the table. They had a roof over their heads. They had hope that their children might climb higher than they had. Shortly after Pablo's birth, the family moved to Envigado, a suburb on the southern edge of Medellín, Colombia's second-largest city. Envigado was a place caught between worlds, neither fully rural nor fully urban, a town where traditional Colombian values mixed uneasily with the modernization and upheaval sweeping through the country in the 1950s. It was a time of tremendous violence in Colombia, a period known simply as La Violencia, when political conflicts between conservative and liberal factions tore the nation apart and left hundreds of thousands dead. Children growing up in Envigado in those years learned early that the world was a dangerous place, that life was cheap, that power came from the barrel of a gun. Pablo attended school, though accounts suggest he was an unremarkable student, neither brilliant nor hopeless. Simply another boy sitting in classrooms taught by women like his mother, learning to read and write and count. Teachers who remembered him later described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, obsessed with his appearance and nursing a complex about his height, as he was shorter than many of his peers. But beneath that quiet exterior, something else was developing. Pablo Escobar had ambition, he had dreams, and from a very young age, he understood that the path his parents had walked, the path of honest work and modest rewards, was not the path he intended to follow. There are stories, perhaps apocryphal, of young Pablo telling his mother that one day he would be rich and famous, that he would be president of Colombia. Whether he actually said such things, or whether they were invented later to add mythic weight to his biography, the sentiment captures something essential about the man he would become. Pablo Escobar believed himself destined for greatness. He looked at the poverty around him, at the limited opportunities available to a farmer's son in a country where the elite held all the cards, and he decided that he would not accept those limitations. If the legitimate avenues to power and wealth were closed to him, then he would find illegitimate ones. His criminal career began small. Most criminal careers do. As a teenager in the 1960s, Pablo was involved in various petty schemes. He sold fake diplomas to students who could not afford real education. He smuggled contraband cigarettes and stereo equipment. He stole tombstones from graveyards and resold them after sandblasting off the names of the dead. These were not the crimes of a hardened gangster, but of a hustler, a young man testing the boundaries of what he could get away with, learning the fundamental lesson that would shape his entire life: that rules were for other people, and that money could be made anywhere if you had the nerve to take it. In 1974, at the age of 24, Pablo Escobar was arrested for the first time. The charge was car theft. He had been stealing vehicles and reselling them, a common crime in Colombia at the time. The arrest should have been a warning, a chance to step back from the edge before it was too late. Instead, it taught him a different lesson: that the Colombian justice system was weak, that with the right connections and the right bribes, almost any problem could be solved. He spent little time in custody. The charges were eventually dropped or reduced. Pablo walked free, and the lesson stuck. Punished. By the mid-1970s, Pablo Escobar had moved into a more lucrative enterprise: kidnapping. Working with his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, who would become his closest confidant and partner for years to come, Pablo began targeting wealthy businessmen for ransom. In 1971, they kidnapped Diego Echevarria, a prominent Medellin industrialist. They collected a ransom of $50,000, an enormous sum for young men from Envigado. Then, despite having received payment, they killed Echevarria. It was unnecessary, it was vicious, and it sent a message that would echo throughout Pablo's career: that he did not play by the rules, not even the rules of the criminal underworld. If you crossed him, if you were simply unlucky enough to be useful to him, your life meant nothing. But kidnapping, for all its profitability, was labor-intensive and risky. Each operation required planning and execution. Each victim brought the possibility of police attention. Pablo was looking for something bigger, something that could generate wealth on a scale that would lift him permanently out of the world he had been born into. And in the early 1970s, just as Pablo was seeking his fortune, the world handed him the opportunity he needed: cocaine. Sluggish. The drug had existed for decades, used primarily by the wealthy and famous in North America and Europe, a powder associated with glamour and excess. But in the 1970s, demand exploded. The counterculture movement, the disco era, the cultural shifts in the United States created a massive market for cocaine, and that market needed suppliers. Colombia, with its geographic position between the coca-growing regions of Peru and Bolivia and the consumer markets of North America, was perfectly situated to become the world's cocaine processing and trafficking hub. All it needed was men ruthless enough and ambitious enough to build the infrastructure. Pablo Escobar was exactly that kind of man. He was not the first Colombian to enter the cocaine trade, but he approached it with a vision and a brutality that set him apart. He saw what others did not: that cocaine was not just another drug to be smuggled in small quantities by individual dealers. It was an opportunity to build an industrial empire, a vertically integrated operation that would control every step of the process, from sourcing coca paste in the Andes to distributing powder on the streets of Miami and New York. He saw the future, and the future was worth billions. And so, in 1976, Pablo Escobar, along with the Ochoa brothers, Carlos Leda, and José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, founded what would become known to the world as the Medellin cartel. It was not called a cartel at first. That term would come later, applied by law enforcement to describe the unprecedented scale and organization of their operation. But from the beginning, it was clear that this was something different, something more dangerous than anything Colombia had seen before. Pablo Escobar was 26 years old. He had been stealing cars and kidnapping businessmen just a few years earlier. Now, he was building an empire that would change the world. The boy from Envigado was about to become the king of cocaine, and Colombia would never be the same. The rise of a criminal empire. 863. The cocaine business in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not yet the hyper-militarized, ultra-violent enterprise it would become. It was an industry in its infancy, chaotic and disorganized, a gold rush where fortunes were being made by anyone bold enough to take the risk. Smugglers moved cocaine in small quantities, hiding it in suitcases and shoe heels, relying on luck and improvisation. It was profitable, certainly, but it was still operating on a criminal scale, not an industrial one. Pablo Escobar saw the inefficiency, and he saw opportunity. While others were content to make hundreds of thousands of dollars moving a few kilograms at a time, Pablo was thinking in tons. He began by partnering with men who shared his vision. Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Ochoa Vasquez were from a wealthy family involved in the horse breeding business in Medellin. They had money, connections, and a willingness to invest in the emerging drug trade. Carlos Leda was a visionary smuggler who had served time in a United States prison alongside George Jung and had learned the American market inside out. José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, brought muscle and ruthlessness. Together, they formed a loose alliance that would come to dominate the cocaine trade. Presidential, who emerged as the driving force, the architect of what was to come. His genius, if such a word can be applied to the construction of a criminal empire, lay in his understanding that cocaine trafficking was fundamentally a logistics problem. The coca leaf grew in Peru and Bolivia. The cocaine consumers lived in the United States. In between stood Colombia, with its long coastlines, its mountains and jungles, its weak government institutions. If you could solve the logistics, if you could move products safely and efficiently from point A to point B, you could make unlimited money. Pablo invested heavily in infrastructure, where coca paste imported from Peru and Bolivia could be processed into cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder that sold for premium prices in Miami and New York. These labs operated around the clock, hidden beneath the jungle canopy, protected by armed guards and by the simple fact that the Colombian government had neither the resources nor the will to search every remote valley in the Andes. At their peak, the Medellin cartel's labs were processing tons of cocaine every week, industrial-scale production that dwarfed anything the world had seen before. Then came the problem of transportation. Pablo and his partners developed multiple smuggling routes, diversifying to reduce risk. They used small planes, flying under radar, landing on clandestine airstrips carved out of the jungle or on remote beaches. They used boats, fast, go-fast boats that could outrun Coast Guard vessels, and larger cargo ships with hidden compartments. They employed human mules, poor Colombians, desperate enough to swallow cocaine-filled condoms and board commercial flights to the United States, risking death if one of the packages burst inside them. They even experimented with submarines, crude semi-submersibles, built in jungle workshops that could carry tons of cocaine just below the ocean's surface. Can Carlos Leda took innovation to another level. He purchased Norman's Cay, a small island in the Bahamas, and transformed it into a private transshipment hub. Planes loaded with cocaine would land on Norman's Cay, refuel, and then make the short hop to Florida. For a time, Leda lived there like a king, throwing parties, indulging in every vice, building a personal paradise funded by the cocaine flowing through his island. It was an audacious operation, and it worked for years before international pressure finally shut it down. But all the infrastructure in the world meant nothing without distribution networks in the United States. Pablo and the Medellin cartel established cells in every major American city: Miami, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago. These distribution networks were staffed by trusted associates, many of them Colombians who had immigrated to the United States, who spoke Spanish and English and could navigate both worlds. They moved the cocaine from importation points to street dealers, collecting cash and wiring it back to Colombia through an elaborate network of money launderers and front businesses. The scale was staggering. At its height in the mid-1980s, the Medellin cartel was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every day. Championships defied comprehension. Cocaine that cost $1,500 per kilogram to produce in Colombian jungle labs could be sold in the United States for $60,000 or more per kilogram. The Medellin cartel was bringing in somewhere between $60 million and $200 million per day, depending on which estimates you believe. All of it was cash, mountains of cash, so much cash that it became a logistical problem in itself. Pablo's brother Roberto, who served as the cartel's accountant, later claimed they spent $2,500 per month just on rubber bands to wrap the stacks of bills. They stored the money in warehouses, and rats would eat through the bills, destroying an estimated 10% of their holdings every year. Losing millions to rodents was simply the cost of doing business when you were making billions. Pablo Escobar personally amassed a fortune that placed him among the richest people on Earth. Forbes magazine listed him as one of the world's billionaires for 7 consecutive years, from 1987 to 1993, estimating his wealth at somewhere between $25 and $30 billion at its peak. He spent that money with the abandon of a man who believed wealth had no limits. He purchased 19 residences in Medellin alone, each luxurious, each with its own security, each accessible by helicopter. He built Hacienda Nápoles, a 2,800-hectare estate in the Colombian countryside that became the physical manifestation of his power and his delusions of grandeur. Hacienda Nápoles was not merely a home, it was a monument to excess. Pablo spent $63 million constructing it. The estate featured a full-size soccer field, a bullfighting arena, an airstrip for his private planes, artificial lakes, a go-kart track, and even a collection of life-size dinosaur sculptures. But the most famous feature of Hacienda Nápoles was the zoo. Pablo imported exotic animals from around the world: giraffes, elephants, rhinoceroses, and, most famously, hippopotamuses. The hippos would become part of his legend, outliving him by decades, multiplying in the Colombian rivers after his death, an invasive species that remains a problem for Colombian authorities to this day, a living legacy of his ecological irresponsibility. Inside the estate, Pablo lived like a feudal lord. He threw lavish parties for friends, associates, and politicians, events where cocaine and champagne flowed freely, where beauty queens and prostitutes entertained guests, where the rules of normal society simply did not apply. He had a private army of sicarios, young assassins recruited from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, trained in violence and fiercely loyal to the man who paid them more money than they could ever have earned through legitimate work. These sicarios lived on the estate, ready to kill or die on Pablo's orders, their devotion absolute. By the early 1980s, the Medellin cartel was at the height of its power. It controlled approximately 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. It had operations in dozens of countries. It had politicians, judges, police officers, and military commanders on its payroll. Pablo Escobar had built one of the most successful criminal enterprises in history. He was richer than most nations. He commanded armies. He had achieved the impossible dream of the poor boy from Envigado. But wealth and power brought new problems. As the cartel grew, so did the attention it attracted. Law enforcement agencies in the United States and Colombia began to coordinate their efforts. The violence required to maintain control escalated. Rival traffickers, notably the Cali cartel, began to challenge Medellin's dominance, and Pablo's own paranoia and ruthlessness created enemies within his organization, men who had once been loyal but who began to question whether serving Pablo Escobar was worth the danger it brought. The empire was at its zenith, but the cracks were already forming, hairline fractures in a structure built on money and fear, and those cracks would widen into chasms that would eventually bring the entire edifice crashing down. Pablo Escobar had conquered the cocaine trade. Now, he would have to face the consequences of that conquest, and the world would discover that no amount of money, no amount of power, could protect him from the enemies he had made. The Two Faces of Pablo. Advises to understand Pablo Escobar, you must understand the paradox at the heart of his existence. He was a mass murderer who built schools. He was a narco-terrorist who gave homes to the homeless. He was responsible for thousands of deaths, yet when he died, thousands of people lined the streets of Medellin to mourn him. The contradiction was not an accident. It was deliberate, carefully constructed, essential to his power. Pablo Escobar understood something that many criminals do not, that terror alone cannot sustain an empire. You need more than fear. You need loyalty. You need love, or at least something that resembles love, from the people who live in the shadow of your violence. In the early 1980s, as his wealth grew beyond measure, Pablo began to invest heavily in social projects. He built housing for the poor in Medellin's most impoverished neighborhoods, entire barrios that rose from empty lots, hundreds of modest homes given away for free to families who had been living in shacks constructed from scrap metal and cardboard. One neighborhood, built on the slopes of Medellin's hills, was officially named Barrio Pablo Escobar. The residents called him a benefactor, a patron saint. When government officials tried to take credit for the housing, the people of Medellin knew better. They knew who had paid for those houses, and they were grateful. Pablo built soccer fields, complete with lights and stands, in neighborhoods where children had previously played on dirt roads. He funded youth soccer leagues, providing equipment and coaches. In a country where soccer was more than a sport, where it was a religion, where barefoot children dreamed of becoming the next Colombian star to play in Europe, these fields were more than recreation. They were hope. They were proof that someone cared about the poor, that someone saw value in their lives beyond the labor they could provide. He constructed schools and renovated churches. He funded medical clinics in areas where government health services were non-existent. He distributed money directly to families in need, appearing in the comunas with bodyguards and briefcases full of cash, handing out bills to anyone who approached him. Old women blessed him. Children ran after his motorcade, cheering. The poor of Medellin, the forgotten masses who had never benefited from Colombia's oil wealth or its coffee exports, who lived in slums that clung to steep hillsides without running water or electricity, saw in Pablo Escobar something they had never seen from their government: generosity. It was brilliant, and it was calculated. Pablo understood that the poorest neighborhoods of Medellin were not just reservoirs of potential recruits for his Sicario armies. They were his shield. As long as the people of the comunas loved him, as long as they saw him as their champion against an indifferent government and an oppressive society, they would protect him. They would never inform on him, the police. They would hide him when he needed to disappear. They would die for him if necessary. The Robin Hood narrative was not entirely manufactured. Pablo Escobar did genuinely come from humble origins. He did understand poverty in a way that Colombia's traditional elite never could. And there is evidence that he took genuine pleasure in his philanthropy, that he enjoyed the adulation of the poor, that some part of him believed his own mythology. But his generosity was never separate from his brutality. They were two sides of the same coin, two tools in his arsenal for maintaining power. The man who built a school in the morning was the same man who ordered a bombing in the afternoon, and he saw no contradiction in this. because he had placed himself above all moral judgment. In 1982, Pablo Escobar took his public image to a new level. He entered politics. Colombia was, on paper, a democracy, but it was a democracy dominated by a handful of elite families who had controlled wealth and power for generations. Pablo, with his billions and his popularity among the poor, decided he would claim a seat at the table. He aligned himself with the Liberal Party, specifically with a faction led by Alberto Santofimio, a politician who understood that Pablo's money could be useful. Pablo financed candidates, including himself, and he was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives. His tenure in Congress was brief and controversial. Pablo used his position to campaign against extradition treaties between Colombia and the United States, arguing that Colombian citizens should be tried in Colombian courts, not sent to American prisons. This was not about nationalism or sovereignty, though he framed it that way. It was about self-preservation. Pablo knew that Colombian judges and prosecutors could be bribed or intimidated. American judges could not. If he was ever extradited to the United States, his wealth and power would mean nothing. He would die in an American supermax prison. His political career ended almost as quickly as it began. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a young reformer who had campaigned against narco-corruption, publicly denounced Pablo on the floor of Congress. He produced evidence that the money funding Pablo's campaigns came from drug trafficking. He called Pablo a criminal, a gangster, unfit to hold public office. The accusation, delivered in front of the nation, destroyed Pablo's political ambitions. He was forced to resign from Congress in early 1984, humiliated and enraged. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla paid for that humiliation with his life. On April 30th, 1984, as Lara Bonilla rode in the back seat of his Mercedes through the streets of Bogotá, two men on a motorcycle pulled alongside. The passenger raised a Mach-10 submachine gun and fired through the window. Lara Bonilla died before reaching the hospital. He was 37 years old. He left behind a wife and 3 children. The assassination shocked Colombia and marked a turning point in the drug war. For the first time, a cabinet minister had been murdered by narco-traffickers. The government could no longer pretend that the cartels were simply criminals who could be managed or negotiated with. They were a direct threat to the state. President Belisario Betancourt responded by reinstating the extradition treaty with the United States. The treaty had existed before, but had not been aggressively enforced. Now it became the weapon the Colombian government would use against the cartels. If Pablo and his associates could not be controlled within Colombia, they would be sent to the United States to face justice there. For Pablo, this was an existential threat. He responded with a declaration of war. The group he led began calling themselves Los Extraditables, and their slogan was simple and chilling. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a cell in the United States. Defiance what followed was a campaign of terror unlike anything Colombia had ever experienced. Pablo and the Medellin cartel did not just fight the government. They tried to break it, to destroy it so completely that the Colombian state would have no choice but to negotiate on Pablo's terms. They bombed police stations, targeting officers and their families. They murdered judges, prosecutors, and journalists. They kidnapped politicians and businessmen. They set off car bombs in crowded streets, killing hundreds of innocent people who had nothing to do with the drug war, but who happened to be near when the explosion occurred. Pablo's philosophy was brutally simple: plata o plomo, silver or lead, bribe or bullet. You took the money he offered, or you took the bullet. There was no third option, no middle ground, no room for compromise. If you were a police officer or a judge, you accepted his bribes, and you looked the other way, or you were murdered. And probably your family was murdered as well. If you were a politician, you supported his agenda, or you were eliminated. The Colombian state was not fighting a criminal organization, it was fighting a parallel state, one that had more money, more firepower, and more willingness to use extreme violence than the legitimate government. And through it all, Pablo continued his philanthropy. He continued to appear in the comunas, handing out money, posing for photographs with children, playing the role of the benevolent patron. The people of Medellin's slums did not care that he was a narco-terrorist. They cared that he built them houses when no one else would. They cared that he gave their children a place to play soccer. They saw the violence as distant, abstract, something that happened to politicians and police officers, people from a different world. Pablo's brutality was for his enemies. His generosity was for his people. That was the narrative he sold, and millions of Colombians bought it. But the truth was darker and simpler than the myth. Pablo Escobar was not a Robin Hood. He did not steal from the rich to give to the poor. He stole from everyone. He stole the futures of countless young Americans who became addicted to the cocaine he flooded into their communities. He stole the lives of police officers and judges and journalists who stood against him. He stole the peace and security of an entire nation. And the houses he built, the soccer fields and schools, were not acts of charity. They were investments in his own survival. The price he paid to maintain a shield of human loyalty around himself when the world came hunting. The two faces of Pablo Escobar were never in conflict. They were always part of the same whole, two expressions of a single totalitarian logic. The logic was this: Pablo Escobar did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, to whomever he wanted. If building a school served his interests, he built a school. If murdering a judge served his interests, he murdered a judge. There was no moral calculus, no weighing of right and wrong. There was only power, and the exercise of that power, and the absolute conviction that he was entitled to do anything that maintained or increased his dominion over the world he had constructed. In the end, the face that mattered was not the face of the benefactor or the terrorist. It was the face of the megalomaniac, the man who believed himself above all law and all consequences. That was the real Pablo Escobar, and that was the man who would drag Colombia into the abyss. The war begins. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar's empire had reached a scale that threatened the very foundations of the Colombian state. The Medellin cartel was not simply an organized crime group. It was a parallel government with its own army, its own courts, its own codes of conduct. It controlled territory, collected taxes from businesses and residents in areas under its influence, and dispensed its own brutal form of justice to those who violated its rules. The Colombian government had two choices: accept this state within a state, or go to war against it. The government chose war, but it was not prepared for the kind of war Pablo Escobar would wage. After the assassination of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla in April 1984, the Colombian government launched a massive crackdown on the Medellin cartel. President Betancourt authorized the military to raid Hacienda Nápoles and other properties belonging to Pablo and his associates. In March 1984, security forces discovered and destroyed Tranquilandia, a massive cocaine processing complex hidden in the Colombian jungle. The raid resulted in the seizure of 14 tons of cocaine and the destruction of laboratories worth tens of millions of dollars. It was the largest blow against the cartel to date. Pablo responded with a wave of assassinations and bombings that made Lara Bonilla's murder look like the opening shot in a much longer war. Over the next several years, the Medellin cartel would be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Colombian officials, including judges, police officers, politicians, and journalists. Anyone who spoke out against the cartel, anyone who pursued cases against its members, anyone who supported extradition, became a target. Judges died by the dozen. Colombia's Supreme Court became a death sentence for anyone appointed to hear drug trafficking cases. Many judges resigned rather than risk their lives and their families' lives. Those who remained worked under constant threat. Some accepted bribes. Others simply ruled in favor of the cartel out of fear. The Colombian justice system, never particularly strong or independent, essentially collapsed under the weight of the terror. Pablo had achieved one of his primary goals: legal impunity through intimidation. But the most shocking act of violence came on November 6, 1985, when members of the M19 guerrilla group, allegedly financed by Pablo Escobar, stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, the seat of Colombia's Supreme Court. The guerrillas took the justices and hundreds of civilians hostage. The Colombian military responded by launching an all-out assault on the building. In the ensuing battle and fire, more than 100 people died, including 11 Supreme Court justices. The official story was that the military had no choice, that the guerrillas had started the fire and killed the hostages. But evidence later emerged suggesting that the military had been ordered to assault the building, regardless of casualties, possibly because the Supreme Court was holding files related to the extradition treaty that Pablo wanted destroyed. Whether Pablo financed the Palace of Justice siege remains disputed, but what is undeniable is that the attack benefited him directly. The files on extradition cases were destroyed. The Supreme Court was crippled. The message to the Colombian government was clear: Pablo Escobar could strike anywhere, at any time, including at the very heart of Colombian power. The violence escalated throughout the late 1980s. The cartels were not fighting only the government, they were also fighting each other. The Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel, rivals for control of the cocaine trade, engaged in a vicious war that killed hundreds of their respective associates and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Bombs exploded in Medellin and Cali. Bodies appeared in ditches and rivers. The death toll mounted so high that it became impossible to keep accurate count. And then came 1989, the year that would mark the apex of Pablo Escobar's terror campaign and the beginning of his eventual downfall. Forging forth 1989, Luis Carlos Galán Sarmiento, a charismatic senator and the leading candidate for Colombia's presidency, announced his candidacy for the 1990 election. Galán was different from other Colombian politicians. He came from the Liberal Party, like many others, but he had broken with the party establishment to form his own movement, Nuevo Liberalismo, New Liberalism. He campaigned on anti-corruption and anti-drug platforms. He openly supported extradition of narco-traffickers to the United States. He was young, eloquent, and enormously popular. Polls showed him leading the race with 60% favorable ratings. If Luis Carlos Galán became president, Pablo Escobar knew his war against the state would become much harder to win. On August 18, 1989, Galán traveled to the town of Soacha, just outside Bogotá, for a campaign rally. Despite warnings from his security team that intelligence reports indicated an assassination attempt was imminent, Galán insisted on going. He was surrounded by 18 armed bodyguards. He was wearing a bulletproof vest. He believed he was safe. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, as Galán stepped onto the stage to address a crowd of 10,000 supporters, gunmen opened fire. At least one shooter, Jaime Rueda, armed with a submachine gun, fired from close range. The bullets struck Galán just below the bulletproof vest and in areas not covered by armor. He fell on the stage as his bodyguards returned fire and the crowd panicked. Galán was rushed to a hospital but was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 45 years old. The assassination of Luis Carlos Galán sent shockwaves through Colombia and the international community. President Virgilio Barco Vargas declared a state of siege. He vowed that extradition would be implemented immediately and aggressively. The Colombian government, backed by the United States, launched an unprecedented manhunt for the leaders of the Medellin cartel. Special police units were formed. Rewards of millions of dollars were offered for information leading to arrests. The war between the state and the cartels entered a new and even deadlier phase. Pablo Escobar responded with a campaign of terror so extreme that it shocked even a nation that had become accustomed to drug violence. On November 27, 1989, just 3 months after Galán's assassination, a bomb exploded aboard Avianca Flight 203, a domestic flight traveling from Bogotá to Cali. The bomb, hidden in a briefcase and detonated 5 minutes after takeoff, ripped through the Boeing 727 at 13,000 feet. The explosion ignited fuel vapors in the plane's tanks, causing a catastrophic fire. Eyewitnesses on the ground reported seeing the aircraft engulfed in flames as it broke apart in mid-air. All 107 people on board were killed instantly. 3 people on the ground died when debris struck them. 110 dead for a single assassination attempt that did not even succeed. Pablo's target had been Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, who had taken over Galan's campaign after his assassination and was continuing his push for the presidency. Intelligence had suggested Gaviria would be on the flight. At the last minute, following security advice, Gaviria changed his travel plans. He was not on board. The 107 innocent people who died, including crew members and passengers who had nothing to do with Colombian politics or the drug war, died for nothing. They died because Pablo Escobar was willing to kill anyone, anywhere, at any time, if there was even a chance it might further his goals. The Avianca bombing marked a new low in narco-terrorism. It was not targeted violence. It was mass murder, indiscriminate slaughter, the act of a man who had lost whatever vestige of humanity he might once have possessed. Conquered, 9 days later, on December 6, 1989, Pablo struck again. A truck loaded with 500 kilograms of dynamite was parked outside the headquarters of the Administrative Department of Security, Colombia's equivalent of the FBI, in downtown Bogotá. At 7:40 in the morning, during rush hour, the bomb detonated. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed the DAS building entirely, reduced it to rubble, and twisted steel. Buildings within a 5-block radius were damaged. 63 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. The blast shattered windows miles away. The shockwave was felt across Bogotá. Once again, most of the dead were innocent civilians, people walking to work, people waiting at bus stops, people who had no connection to Pablo Escobar or the drug war, beyond the misfortune of being nearby when he decided to make a point. Cohibited was in a state of shock and rage. The bombings had crossed a line that even in a country accustomed to violence seemed unthinkable. This was not the work of a criminal trying to evade capture. This was terrorism in its purest form, violence designed to create terror, to break the will of the government and the people. Pablo was no longer fighting to protect his business. He was fighting to prove that he was more powerful than the state, that he could do anything he wanted and no one could stop him. Administrators and his rage and his hubris, Pablo had miscalculated. The bombings, especially Avianca Flight 203, turned Colombian public opinion decisively against him. People who had previously viewed him with a mix of fear and grudging respect now saw him as a monster. The poor neighborhoods that had once shielded him began to waver. Mothers whose sons had joined his Sicario armies started to question whether the money he paid was worth the blood it brought. Even other drug traffickers, including the Cali cartel, distanced themselves from Pablo, fearing that his extremism would bring down the entire industry. The international community also responded. 2 Americans had been on Avianca Flight 203, and their deaths brought the full weight of the United States government into the war against Pablo Escobar. President George H.W. Bush authorized the deployment of U.S. military and intelligence assets to Colombia. The CIA, the DEA, Delta Force, and later Navy SEALs joined Colombian forces in the hunt for the Medellin cartel's leaders. Advanced surveillance technology, including aircraft capable of triangulating radio and telephone signals, was provided to Colombian authorities. The noose was tightening. By 1990, several of Pablo's top lieutenants had been killed or captured. José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, El Mexicano, was killed in a gun battle with Colombian police in December 1989, just weeks after the DAS bombing. Carlos Leda had already been captured and extradited to the United States in 1987, where he was sentenced to life in prison. The Ochoa brothers, facing the prospect of extradition, began negotiations to surrender under the promise of reduced sentences. Pablo's organization was fragmenting, his enemies were multiplying, and worst of all, his family, the people he claimed to value above all else, were in danger. On January 13, 1988, a car bomb exploded outside one of Pablo's properties while his wife Maria Victoria and his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were inside. The blast was powerful enough to cause significant damage. Manuela, who was just 4 years old, suffered permanent hearing loss in one ear from the explosion. The attack had been carried out by the Cali cartel, or possibly by a rival faction within the Medellin cartel. Regardless of who was responsible, the message was clear. Pablo's enemies were willing to target his family directly. For a man who styled himself as a family-oriented patriarch, this was intolerable. Pablo had always drawn a distinction, however hypocritical, between his criminal activities and his role as a husband, father. He kept his family away from the violence. He built them homes and gave them luxuries and tried to pretend that they were not complicit in or beneficiaries of his crimes. The bombing shattered that illusion. His children were not safe. His wife was not safe. And if they were not safe, then what was the point of all the money and all the power? By 1991, Pablo Escobar was exhausted. He had been on the run, moving constantly, unable to sleep in the same place twice, separated from his family, hunted by governments and rival traffickers. The war he had started with such confidence in the mid-1980s had become a grinding, unwinnable conflict. Every victory was temporary. Every problem he solved created new problems. His wealth meant nothing when he could not enjoy it. His power meant nothing when he could not protect the people he loved. And so, incredibly, the man who had bombed airplanes and government buildings, who had assassinated presidential candidates and Supreme Court justices, who had declared war on the entire Colombian state, decided to surrender. But not on the state's terms, on his own terms, because even in defeat, Pablo Escobar refused to accept that anyone else held power over him. La Catedral, the prison palace. The negotiations for Pablo Escobar's surrender began in secret in early 1991. The Colombian government, exhausted by years of violence and under enormous pressure from the United States to end the drug war, was willing to consider almost any deal that would take Pablo off the streets. Pablo, facing intensifying heat from search block operations and isolated from his family, was willing to surrender, but only if certain conditions were met. Those conditions were extraordinary, even by the standards of Colombian corruption. Not be extradited to the United States under any circumstances. This was non-negotiable. He had seen what happened to Carlos Leda and others who had been sent to American prisons. Life in an American supermax facility, isolated from supporters, unable to bribe guards or judges, was a fate worse than death as far as Pablo was concerned. Better to be imprisoned in Colombia, where his money and influence could still operate, where he could remain near his family, where there was always the possibility of escape. Second, Pablo demanded that he be allowed to build his own prison. He would choose the location, he would choose the guards, he would choose the conditions of his confinement. The Colombian government, desperate to end the bombing campaigns that had terrorized the country, agreed. It was an astonishing capitulation, an admission that the state had lost control, that it was negotiating not with a criminal, but with a rival power. Blindness on June 19, 1991, the same day that Colombia's Constituent Assembly voted to prohibit extradition in the new Colombian constitution, Pablo Escobar surrendered. The timing was not coincidental. Pablo had spent enormous amounts of money bribing and threatening members of the assembly to ensure that extradition would be banned. With the constitution changed, with his immunity from extradition guaranteed, he was willing to submit to what he called imprisonment, but what was in reality little more than a strategic retreat. Gasoline, he was transferred by helicopter to his new prison, a facility he had spent the previous months designing and building. It was located in the hills above Envigado, overlooking Medellin, the city he had grown up in and come to dominate. The prison was called La Catedral, the Cathedral, though the name was ironic rather than religious. It was a cathedral to Pablo's power, a monument to his ability to bend even his own imprisonment to his will. La Catedral was not a prison in any meaningful sense. It was a fortress, a luxury compound designed to keep Pablo's enemies out rather than to keep him in. The facility was surrounded by a 12-foot wall and patrolled by guards chosen and paid by Pablo himself, men whose loyalty was to him alone, not to the Colombian government. Inside the walls, Pablo enjoyed accommodations that would have been the envy of most free men. His personal suite featured a king-size rotating bed, a bathroom with a jacuzzi, a fully stocked bar with premium liquor, and a private office with telephones, fax machines, and computers that allowed him to continue running his empire. The prison complex included a full-size soccer field with lights and stands, a billiards room, a disco complete with sound system and dance floor, a gym, a sauna, and a dollhouse that Pablo had built for his daughter to play in during her visits. There was an industrial kitchen, staffed by professional chefs who prepared gourmet meals. There was a waterfall, artificial lakes, and landscaped gardens. By any standard, La Catedral was more resort than prison, more palace than penitentiary. The Colombian government pretended that Pablo was serving a sentence, that justice was being done. The guards stationed outside the perimeter, regular Colombian national police officers, pretended to maintain security. But everyone knew the truth. La Catedral was Hotel Escobar, Club Medellin, a safe house where Pablo could hide from his enemies while maintaining his lifestyle and his business operations. He was free to receive visitors, and he received many. Associates from the cartel came to discuss business. Family members visited regularly. Politicians and lawyers arrived for consultations. Beauty queens and prostitutes were escorted in for Pablo's entertainment. On one memorable occasion, the entire Colombian national soccer team was invited to La Catedral for lunch and a friendly match on Pablo's private field, with the prison guards serving drinks from the sidelines like waiters at an exclusive club. Pablo used La Catedral as his base of operations. From his office, using his phones and fax machines, he continued to oversee cocaine shipments worth millions of dollars. He communicated with his operatives in the United States and Europe, managing the cartel's finances and logistics. He ordered murders and bombings from behind the walls of his prison, secure in the knowledge that the Colombian government would not interfere. His confinement was a farce, and the entire country knew it. But the farce could not last forever. By mid-1992, reports began to emerge that Pablo was not simply living comfortably in La Catedral, but was continuing his criminal activities with impunity. More troubling were rumors that he had tortured and killed two of his own associates inside the prison. Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Kiko Moncada were members of the Medellin cartel who had been accused of stealing money from Pablo. In July 1992, Pablo invited them to La Catedral for a meeting to resolve the dispute. They arrived expecting a negotiation. What they got was a torture session that lasted for hours. Unfinished, Pablo accused Galeano and Moncada of embezzling millions of dollars that belonged to the cartel. Whether the accusation was true remains uncertain. What is certain is that Pablo had both men brutally tortured in front of other cartel members as a warning. Some accounts claim he personally participated in the torture, that he used electrical shocks and other methods to inflict maximum pain before finally ordering their execution. The bodies were disposed of on the prison grounds. When news of the murders leaked to the media, public outrage forced the Colombian government to act. President César Gaviria ordered that Pablo be transferred from La Catedral to a conventional maximum security prison, a real prison where he would have no control over the guards or the conditions. On July 22, 1992, approximately 400 Colombian army troops supported by helicopters, were dispatched to La Catedral to execute the transfer order. Suppressing Pablo was ready. He had always known this day might come, and he had built escape routes into the prison's design. As the military surrounded the compound, Pablo and several of his sicarios opened fire with automatic weapons, engaging the troops in a brief but intense gun battle. Under cover of the chaos, Pablo made his way to a section of the perimeter wall where the mortar had been deliberately weakened. He and his bodyguards kicked through the wall and disappeared into the fog that regularly enveloped the hills at that elevation. By the time the soldiers secured the prison and realized what had happened, Pablo was gone. The escape was a national humiliation for Colombia. The government had negotiated a surrender, had allowed Pablo to build his own prison, had looked the other way while he ran his empire from confinement, and now he had simply walked away. The message was clear to everyone. The Colombian state was weak, perhaps fatally so, and Pablo Escobar was stronger than any institution. But Pablo's escape was also his undoing. During his time in La Catedral, as absurd and insulting as it was, there had been at least a semblance of peace. The bombings had stopped. The assassinations had decreased. People could pretend that some kind of stability had been achieved. Now, with Pablo back on the streets, the war would resume, and this time it would be fought to the finish. There would be no more negotiations, no more deals. The Colombian government, backed by the United States and emboldened by public fury at Pablo's escape, committed itself to hunting him down and killing him if necessary. Pablo Escobar had spent 13 months in La Catedral, living in luxury, running his business, enjoying his wealth. Those 13 months were the last comfortable days of his life. From July 1992 until December 1993, he would be a fugitive, hunted by thousands of enemies, moving from safe house to safe house, unable to see his family, watching his empire crumble around him. He had escaped from prison, but he had escaped into a prison of a different kind, one with walls he could not see, but from which there would be no escape. The end game had begun. The Hunted. Molds, purified for Pablo Escobar, that began in July 1992, was one of the largest and most complex law enforcement operations in history. It involved multiple Colombian government agencies, thousands of police and military personnel, American Special Operations Forces, intelligence agencies from 3 countries, and a shadowy vigilante group that operated in the grey area between legal authority and outright terrorism. And at the center of it all, moving through Medellin like a ghost, was one man who refused to accept that his empire had collapsed, that his time was over, that the world would not bend to his will. The Colombian government formed Search Block, a specialized unit of approximately 600 elite police officers whose sole mission was to locate and capture or kill Pablo Escobar. The unit was led by Colonel Hugo Martinez, a dedicated officer who would spend 16 months in relentless pursuit of his target. Search Block officers operated under enormous pressure and at tremendous personal risk. Pablo had put a price on their heads, reportedly paying his sicarios bounties for each officer they killed. Over the course of the manhunt, more than 600 police officers would die, gunned down in the streets of Medellin or assassinated in their homes along with their families. Being a member of Search Block was effectively a death sentence with a salary, but the unit never lacked for volunteers. Some joined out of patriotism, others sought revenge for colleagues or family members killed by the cartel. All of them understood that this was a war, not a law enforcement operation, and that only one side would walk away. Prohibited, these United States provided critical support. Delta Force operators trained Search Block in advanced tactical operations and intelligence gathering. Navy SEALs provided additional expertise. The CIA shared intelligence from its networks in Colombia and abroad. But the most important American contribution was Centra Spike, a top-secret Army intelligence unit equipped with sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. Centra Spike's aircraft, disguised as civilian planes, circled constantly over Medellin, intercepting radio and telephone transmissions, using triangulation technology to pinpoint the locations of signals. This technology, cutting edge for the early 1990s, would ultimately prove decisive in the hunt for Pablo. But the most controversial element of the manhunt was Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Los Pepes was a paramilitary vigilante group that emerged in early 1993, ostensibly composed of Pablo's victims and enemies, former associates who had been betrayed, families of people he had killed, business owners he had extorted. In reality, Los Pepes was financed by the Cali cartel, Pablo's longtime rivals, who saw an opportunity to eliminate their competition while the government was distracted. The group was led by Fidel Castaño Gil, a paramilitary leader and former Medellin cartel member who had turned against Pablo, and included other defectors like Diego Fernando Murillo Bejarano, known as Don Berna. Los Pepes operated with brutal efficiency. They did not bother with arrest warrants or evidence or due process. They simply killed anyone associated with Pablo Escobar. They murdered his lawyers, his accountants, his sicarios, and his extended family members. They burned and bombed his properties, including several of his mother's homes and his prized estate at Hacienda Nápoles. They kidnapped relatives and associates and left their bodies in the streets with signs reading, "For working with Pablo Escobar." Over the course of 1993, Los Pepes killed more than 300 people connected to Pablo, systematically dismantling his support network, cutting him off from his money, his resources, and his people. MX, the relationship between Los Pepes and the Colombian government, has been the subject of controversy for decades. There is strong evidence that Search Block shared intelligence with Los Pepes, that members of Colombian security forces moonlighted as Los Pepes operatives, that the government essentially outsourced its dirtiest work to a death squad that could operate without legal constraints. American agencies, including the CIA and DEA, were also aware of Los Pepes and allegedly provided information to the group, though official documents from that era remain partially classified. The logic was simple. Los Pepes could do things that Search Block could not, could cross lines that government forces were not permitted to cross, and as long as the deaths were narco-traffickers and criminals, few people in positions of power were inclined to ask too many questions. Transported, the emergence of Los Pepes was catastrophic. He had survived government manhunts before by disappearing into the comunas, protected by loyal sicarios and shielded by the poor people who loved him for his philanthropy. But Los Pepes removed that shield by making anyone who helped Pablo a target. Families who hid him knew that Los Pepes would burn their homes and kill their children. Associates who provided him with money or supplies knew they would be hunted down and executed. The network of loyalty and fear that Pablo had built over decades eroded rapidly under the assault. By late 1993, he was almost completely isolated. Pablo tried desperately to get his family to safety. He attempted several times to have his wife, Maria Victoria, and his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, flown out of Colombia. Twice, he tried to send them to the United States, but American authorities refused them entry. Finally, in November 1993, they boarded a Lufthansa flight to Germany. The plane landed in Frankfurt, and for a brief moment, it seemed Pablo had achieved at least one victory, had managed to get his family beyond the reach of his enemies. But German authorities, alerted by both the DEA and the Colombian government, refused to allow them entry into the country. They were put back on the plane and deported to Colombia, where they were placed under police guard in a hotel in Bogotá. The deportation broke something in Pablo. His family had been his last connection to the person he had been before the violence consumed everything. The man who had built houses for the poor and played with his children and pretended he was more than a mass murderer. With them gone, with no hope of reuniting them, with nothing left to protect or preserve, Pablo became even more desperate and dangerous. He had nothing left to lose. Squalor, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying anywhere for more than a single night, often alone or with just one bodyguard. The man who had once thrown parties for soccer teams and hosted weddings in his luxury prison now slept on mattresses on the floor in bare rooms, ate cold food from cans, and communicated with the outside world through brief, encrypted calls that he knew were being monitored. He was unrecognizable from the Pablo Escobar of the 1980s. His hair had grown long and unkempt. His beard was full and graying. He had lost weight. He looked old, worn down, a hunted animal that knew the chase was ending. But even in his reduced state, Pablo remained dangerous. He still had access to some money, still commanded the loyalty of a core group of sicarios, still had the capacity to order violence. In his final months, he attempted to form a guerrilla movement he called Antioquia Independiente, envisioning himself as a revolutionary leader rather than a fugitive criminal. The idea went nowhere. He reached out to the FARC guerrillas, offering to become an accountant for their drug operations, hoping to find allies who could protect him. They were not interested in sheltering a man who brought the entire might of the Colombian and American governments down on anyone who helped him. By December 1993, Pablo had run out of options. Los Pepes had killed or scattered his organization. Searchblock was using advanced technology to track his every movement. His money meant nothing when he could not access it. His power meant nothing when no one would obey his commands. He was 44 years old, one of the richest men who had ever lived, and he was dying in a borrowed safe house in the city where he had once been king. On December 1st, 1993, Pablo celebrated his birthday in that safe house, accompanied by his mother Hermilda, his cousin Luzmila Gaviria, and his last remaining bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, called El Limón. There was cake, wine, marijuana. It was a small celebration, quiet and sad, nothing like the extravagant parties of his glory days. Pablo knew what was coming. He had always known. He had told his brothers years earlier that if he was ever cornered with no way out, he would shoot himself through the ear. He would not give the government the satisfaction of capturing him alive. He would not end his days in an American prison. The next day, driven by loneliness and desperation, Pablo made his final mistake. He called his family. They were under guard in Bogotá, in a hotel room, terrified and isolated. Pablo needed to hear his son's voice. He needed to tell them he loved them. He needed to believe that somehow, despite everything, they would be okay. He had learned to keep his calls short, no more than 2 minutes, because anything longer gave the surveillance teams enough time to triangulate his position. But on that afternoon, speaking to Juan Pablo, Pablo forgot the rules. The call stretched past 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4. In a command center across Medellin, technicians watching their screens saw the signal lock in. They had him. They had an exact address in the Los Olivos neighborhood. Searchblock mobilized immediately. Within an hour, hundreds of officers had surrounded the block. Helicopters moved into position overhead. This was it. After 16 months of hunting, after hundreds of deaths and thousands of raids, and every resource the Colombian and American governments could bring to bear, they had Pablo Escobar. The final day. The house on Carrera 79B in the Los Olivos neighborhood was unremarkable. A modest 2-story structure indistinguishable from dozens of others on the block. It belonged to someone Pablo knew, someone who had agreed to let him stay there despite the enormous risk. On the second floor, in a sparsely furnished room, Pablo Escobar was ending his phone call to his son when he heard the vehicles outside. He moved to the window and looked down at the street. Police trucks, dozens of officers taking positions, helicopters circling. He had seconds to act, perhaps less. Phased El Limón, his bodyguard, grabbed weapons. They had prepared for this moment, had always known it might come. Every safe house had an escape route, a back door or a window that led to the rooftops where they could run, where the maze of Medellin's buildings might offer one last chance at evasion. They had used this tactic before. Sometimes it worked. The police hit the front door with a battering ram. Gunfire erupted immediately. El Limon fired back, emptying a magazine down the stairwell to buy time. Pablo was already moving toward the rear window, barefoot, carrying a pistol and a submachine gun. He kicked out the window and climbed onto the lower roof, El Limon right behind him. The afternoon sun was hot on the terracotta tiles. The air smelled of gunpowder and diesel from the helicopters overhead. They ran. El Limon went first, sprinting across the rooftop toward the next building. But there was no next building, not close enough. The roof ended. Beyond it was only a drop to the street, and the police were everywhere, surrounding the block, closing in from all sides. El Limon turned to run back toward Pablo when the bullets hit him. Multiple rounds struck his body. He staggered, fell, rolled off the edge of the roof, and dropped to the street below. He was dead before he hit the ground. Pablo was alone now, standing on that rooftop with nowhere to go, surrounded by his enemies, the helicopters so close he could feel the downdraft from their rotors, their spotlights tracking his every movement, even though it was still afternoon and the spotlights were not needed. A redundancy of force, an excess of preparation for this one man who had defied them for so long. He raised his weapon and fired at the police advancing toward him. The shots were wild, desperate, the actions of a man who knew the ending but refused to accept it. Return fire came immediately. A bullet struck Pablo's right leg, shattering bone. He stumbled but kept moving, hopping on his good leg, still clutching his pistol, still defiant. Another bullet hit him in the back, entering near his shoulder blade and lodging in his neck. The pain must have been extraordinary, but Pablo did not scream. He fell to one knee, his body betraying him, his strength finally spent after 44 years of life lived at maximum intensity, years of building and destroying and running and fighting. Entered near his right ear. It traveled through his skull and exited the other side, killing him instantly. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria collapsed onto the red tiles of the rooftop, blood pooling beneath his head, his weapons clattering away. His eyes were open. His face, beneath the long hair and the graying beard, was twisted in an expression that might have been anger or might have been something like relief. He was dead at 44 years and 1 day old. The search block officers approached cautiously, weapons raised, ready for a trick or a trap, because Pablo had fooled them before, had escaped from impossible situations, had seemed to possess some supernatural ability to evade capture. But there was no trick this time. Pablo Escobar was dead, truly and finally dead. His blood spreading across the roof under the Colombian sun. Within minutes, the rooftop was crowded with police and military personnel, all wanting to see the body, to confirm with their own eyes that the nightmare was over. Someone radioed command. Someone called the media. And then, in an act that would become infamous, they began posing for photographs. Colombian police officers and search block members stood over Pablo's corpse, smiling, giving thumbs up, celebrating. One of them grabbed Pablo's hair and lifted his head for the camera. Another placed his boot near Pablo's face. The images were captured and distributed worldwide within hours. They would become iconic, the visual definition of Pablo Escobar's fall, the evidence that no matter how powerful you become, no matter how much money you accumulate or how much fear you inspire, eventually the reckoning comes. Fired the fatal shot remains disputed. Many claimed credit. Some said it was a search block officer on the rooftop. Others said it was a sniper from one of the helicopters. There were whispers that Los Pepes had a man on the scene, that Carlos Castaño Gil himself, or one of his lieutenants, had fired the kill shot and then disappeared before official forces arrived. Pablo's family insisted, and still insist to this day, that he committed suicide, that he shot himself rather than be captured, fulfilling his promise that he would rather have a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States. Psychologist probably does not matter. What matters is that Pablo Escobar died on that rooftop on December 2nd, 1993. And with him died the Medellin cartel, the organization that had terrorized Colombia for more than a decade, that had killed thousands, that had corrupted institutions and entire governments, that had turned cocaine from a niche luxury drug into a global scourge. The king was dead. The empire was finished. News of Pablo's death spread through Medellin within an hour. In the wealthy neighborhoods, people celebrated quietly, relieved that the terror was over. In the government offices, there was exhaustion mixed with triumph. President Gaviria made a statement praising the security forces and promising that Colombia would now move forward into peace. In Washington, President Clinton and DEA administrators held press conferences declaring victory in the war on drugs, conveniently ignoring that cocaine trafficking would continue unabated without Pablo. But in the comunas, in the poor neighborhoods where Pablo had built houses and soccer fields, the reaction was different. Thousands of people poured into the streets, not to celebrate, but to mourn. They made their way to the funeral home where Pablo's body had been taken. They lined up for blocks, waiting hours for a chance to pass by his casket. Women wept openly. Men stood in silence, their faces grim. Children held candles. To these people, Pablo Escobar was not a terrorist or a mass murderer. He was the man who had cared for them when no one else did, who had given them homes and hope and dignity in a society that offered them nothing. The funeral itself drew a crowd estimated at 25,000 people. Pablo's mother, Hermilda, dressed in black, stood by the casket and wept. His wife, Maria Victoria, and his children were not there, still under guard in Bogotá, forbidden from attending by authorities who feared their presence would incite riots. The mourners filed past, many of them reaching out to touch the casket, crossing themselves, praying for the soul of the man who had been both their benefactor and their curse. Pablo was buried in the Monte Sacro cemetery in Medellin, in an above-ground tomb that would become a pilgrimage site for some and a target for vandalism for others. His grave marker is simple, bearing his name and dates, nothing more. There are no grand statements, no epitaphs declaring his greatness or explaining his crimes. Just a name and the years he lived, as if the story of Pablo Escobar could be contained in such simplicity. The truth is more complicated, as truth always is. Pablo Escobar was not simply a monster, though he was monstrous. He was not simply a Robin Hood, though he played that role skillfully. He was a product of his time and his place, a man who saw a broken system and decided to break it further, who recognized that power in Colombia belonged to those willing to seize it by any means necessary. He built an empire on the suffering of millions, on the addiction of American cocaine users and the murder of Colombian officials and the terror of an entire nation. And when that empire finally collapsed, when the world came to destroy him, he refused to accept it, fought until the very end, and died as violently as he had lived. The photograph of Pablo's corpse on the rooftop, surrounded by smiling police officers, was distributed around the world. It appeared on the front page of newspapers from New York to London to Tokyo. It was broadcast on television news programs globally. The image said, "This is what happens to narco-terrorists. This is what happens when you wage war on governments. This is the fate of all who believe themselves above the law." The message was simple and brutal and effective. Pablo Escobar was dead, his body displayed like a trophy, and the world could sleep a little easier knowing he was gone. But the story did not end on that rooftop. The consequences of Pablo's life and death would echo through the decades to come, shaping Colombia's future, influencing global drug policy, and ensuring that the name Pablo Escobar would never be forgotten, for better or worse. The Reckoning. Shading. Within days of Pablo Escobar's death, the Medellin cartel ceased to exist as a cohesive organization. Without his leadership, without his ability to inspire both loyalty and terror, the network fragmented into dozens of smaller groups, each fighting for control of the scraps of his empire. Some tried to maintain trafficking routes to the United States, but they lacked Pablo's vision and organizational skills. Most were killed by rivals or arrested by authorities who were emboldened by their success against Pablo and eager to press their advantage before the cartels could regroup. Windshield cartel, Pablo's longtime rival, immediately moved to fill the vacuum. For the next several years, the Cali organization, led by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers and José Santa Cruz Londoño, would dominate the cocaine trade. But they had learned from Pablo's mistakes. They operated with less overt violence, preferred bribes to bullets, tried to present themselves as businessmen rather than terrorists. It worked for a time, but ultimately, the Colombian government, with American assistance, dismantled the Cali cartel as well. By the mid-1990s, most of its leaders were dead or in prison. The cocaine trade did not end with Pablo Escobar's death. It evolved. Trafficking became more decentralized, more international. Mexican cartels, which had served as transporters for Colombian organizations in the 1980s and early 1990s, began to produce and distribute cocaine themselves, eventually surpassing their Colombian predecessors in power and sophistication. The demand in the United States did not decrease. The violence shifted locations, from Colombia to Mexico, from city streets to border towns, but it never stopped. Pablo had not created the cocaine trade, and killing him did not destroy it. He had simply been the most visible, most successful, most ruthless player in a game that would continue long after his death. For Colombia, the end of Pablo Escobar marked a turning point, but not a solution. The country had been devastated by a decade of drug violence. Thousands were dead. Institutions were corrupted beyond easy repair. Trust in government was shattered. The economy had been distorted by billions of dollars in narco money. Entire regions were controlled by paramilitary groups or guerrillas, many of whom had connections to the drug trade. The Colombian conflict, which had existed in various forms since La Violencia in the 1940s, would continue for another 2 decades, evolving to include FARC guerrillas, AUC paramilitaries, and successor drug trafficking organizations. The peace agreement with FARC would not come until 2016, and even then, violence persists. PayPal's family faced their own reckoning. His widow, Maria Victoria Henao, and his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, spent years in exile, moving from country to country, seeking asylum, trying to escape the shadow of Pablo's legacy. Juan Pablo, who was 16 when his father died, eventually changed his name to Sebastián Marroquín. He became an architect and author, writing books and giving interviews about growing up as Pablo Escobar's son. He has expressed remorse for his father's crimes and has met with some of Pablo's victims, including the children of Luis Carlos Galán and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, seeking some form of reconciliation. In interviews, Sebastián has said that his father was not a person to be imitated, that Pablo showed Colombia the path it must never take, the path to self-destruction and the loss of values. Manuela, Pablo's daughter, who was 9 years old when he died, has lived a more private life, struggling with the trauma of her childhood, the violence she witnessed, the knowledge that her father was responsible for so much suffering. She reportedly suffers from depression and has attempted to live anonymously, to escape the curse of the Escobar name. For her, there is no redemption, no path to recovery, only the burden of being the daughter of a monster who loved her, but who also brought hell into her life. The victims of Pablo Escobar number in the thousands. More than 5,000 people died during the cartel's war against the Colombian state between 1984 and 1993. That figure includes police officers, judges, journalists, politicians, and countless civilians who were in the wrong place when a bomb exploded or when sicarios fired their weapons. It does not include the people killed in cartel wars, or those murdered by Los Pepes during the manhunt, or the addicts who died from overdoses on the cocaine Pablo's organization flooded into American cities. The true body count is impossible to calculate, but it is enormous. A mountain of corpses built on one man's ambition and greed. Some of those victims have been forgotten by history. They were ordinary people, poor people, people with no power or wealth, people who died because they happened to be nearby when Pablo decided to send a message. Others are remembered. Luis Carlos Galán, who might have been president, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who stood against narco-corruption, Guillermo Cano, editor of El Espectador newspaper, assassinated in 1986, the passengers and crew of Avianca Flight 203, the workers in the DAS building, the police officers and their families hunted down and killed for doing their jobs. Each of them had names, had families, had futures that Pablo stole from them. Their names deserve to be spoken, their lives deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes to Pablo's story, but as people who were destroyed by his choices. Colombia has struggled with how to remember Pablo Escobar. In Medellin, his legacy is contested. Some neighborhoods still bear the marks of his philanthropy, the houses he built, the soccer fields, the schools. Some older residents, particularly in the poorest areas, still speak of him with a kind of nostalgia, remembering the man who helped them when the government did not. Younger generations, those who did not live through the violence, know Pablo primarily from television shows and movies that romanticize his life, that turn him into a folk hero, that erase the blood and the terror in favor of dramatic narratives about a poor boy who became rich and powerful. Paycheck. But many Colombians, perhaps most Colombians, want to forget him entirely. They want to move past that era, to build a country not defined by drug violence and corruption, to remember the victims rather than the perpetrator. In 2019, the government demolished the Monaco building, Pablo's former 8-story mansion in Medellin, which had become a tourist attraction and a symbol of narco glamour. The demolition was intentional, a statement that Colombia would not celebrate or memorialize its drug lords, that the legacy of that era was one of shame, not pride. Hacienda Nápoles, Pablo's massive estate, has been converted into a theme park. Tourists can visit the ruins of his mansion, walk past the dinosaur sculptures, see the animals in what remains of the zoo. The hippopotamuses he imported have multiplied and now roam Colombian rivers, an ecological disaster created by one man's whim. The estate is both a tourist attraction and a cautionary tale, a place where people can see the physical remnants of Pablo's empire, while being reminded, through museums and educational exhibits, of the cost of that empire in human lives. Fullback, the international community, has also grappled with Pablo's legacy. He has been the subject of dozens of books, countless documentaries, and high-budget television series, including Netflix's Narcos. These portrayals vary wildly in quality and intent. Some attempt serious historical analysis, others fall into the trap of glamorization, presenting Pablo as an anti-hero, a rebel against an unjust system, rather than as what he truly was, a terrorist and mass murderer who destroyed thousands of lives in pursuit of wealth and power. There is a danger in this glamorization. When young people in Latin America and around the world watch shows about Pablo Escobar and see him portrayed as a powerful figure who lived by his own rules, who defied governments and became fabulously wealthy, who died on his own terms rather than submitting to authority, they may draw the wrong lessons. They may see the wealth and the power and miss the corpses beneath them. They may see the legend and miss the reality. This is the curse of storytelling, that any story, no matter how brutal, can be made to seem exciting or romantic if you choose the right angles and leave out enough truth. The truth is that Pablo Escobar's life was a tragedy, not just for him, but for everyone who lived through it. He had opportunities to be different, to use his intelligence and ambition for something other than destruction. He could have been a legitimate businessman, a politician advocating for the poor from within the system, a builder rather than a destroyer. But he chose another path, and that choice rippled outward, touching millions of lives, altering the course of a nation's history. Legacy of ashes. Stabilize. More than 3 decades after his death, Pablo Escobar remains one of the most famous criminals in history. His name is recognized globally, synonymous with cocaine trafficking and narco-terrorism. But fame is not the same as legacy, and understanding what Pablo left behind requires looking beyond the Netflix series and the tourist attractions to the actual consequences of his life and death. Clang. The most immediate legacy was the destruction he wrought on Colombia. The violence of the 1980s and early 1990s traumatized an entire generation. Parents lost children, children lost parents. Families were torn apart by bombs and bullets. Communities were terrorized by cartel sicarios and by the police and military responses to cartel violence. The psychological scars remain. Colombia has one of the highest rates of mental health issues in Latin America, a statistic directly connected to decades of conflict, much of it related to the drug trade that Pablo helped build into an industrial enterprise. Institutionally, the damage was profound. Pablo's campaign of bribes and assassinations corrupted Colombia's judiciary, police forces, and political system. He proved that institutions could be bought or broken, that the rule of law was negotiable, that violence could achieve what persuasion could not. Even after his death, the culture of corruption he reinforced persisted. Politicians continued to accept cartel money, police continued to work for traffickers, judges continued to fear for their lives. Rebuilding trust in institutions, establishing the rule of law, creating a government that citizens could believe in, these tasks have taken decades and remain incomplete. Psychologically, Pablo's legacy is mixed. On one hand, the billions of dollars that flowed through the Medellin cartel created jobs, built infrastructure, and provided income to thousands of Colombians who participated in the trade at various levels. In the short term, narco money stimulated certain sectors of the Colombian economy. But the long-term damage far outweighed any temporary benefits. The drug trade distorted currency markets, contributed to inflation, crowded out legitimate businesses that could not compete with narco-funded enterprises, and directed investment and talent away from productive industries. Colombia's reputation suffered internationally, discouraging foreign investment and tourism. The country became synonymous with drugs and violence in the global imagination, an association it has spent decades trying to overcome. In the international arena, Pablo Escobar fundamentally changed how the world thinks about drug trafficking. Before Pablo, drugs were primarily a law enforcement issue, a problem to be managed by police and customs agents. After Pablo, drugs became a national security issue, a threat that required military responses, international cooperation, and strategies that blurred the line between law enforcement and warfare. The United States declared a war on drugs that would consume billions of dollars and countless lives over the next several decades. Colombia became the primary battleground in that war, receiving American military aid, training, and direct intervention. The war on drugs, launched in part as a response to Pablo Escobar, has been widely criticized as a failure. Cocaine production and trafficking did not decrease significantly after Pablo's death. New cartels emerged to replace the old ones. Mexican organizations took over routes and distribution that had previously been controlled by Colombians. The violence moved and mutated, but did not disappear. Incarceration rates skyrocketed, particularly in the United States, where hundreds of thousands of people, disproportionately minorities, were imprisoned for drug-related offenses. The war's costs, both financial and human, have been staggering, and many experts now argue that prohibition-based approaches to drugs create more problems than they solve. Pablo's life and death also influenced how criminal organizations operate. The Medellin cartel, under Pablo's leadership, was highly centralized, with one leader making most major decisions. This structure proved vulnerable. Remove the leader and the organization collapses. Subsequent trafficking groups learned from this mistake. Modern cartels are more decentralized, more cell-based, more resilient to the capture or killing of individual leaders. This evolution has made them harder to combat, but also less capable of the kind of coordinated terrorism that Pablo unleashed. There are no longer drug lords who can bomb airplanes or declare war on governments. The trade continues, but it operates more quietly, more pragmatically, more aware that excessive violence attracts attention that is bad for business. On a personal level, Pablo's legacy is the sorrow of those he harmed. The families of Luis Carlos Galan and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla live with the absence of fathers and husbands who were murdered for doing what was right. The families of police officers killed in the line of duty remember their loved ones as heroes who paid the ultimate price fighting narco-terrorism. The passengers on Avianca Flight 203, the workers in the DAS building, the countless others who died in bombings or assassinations, they are gone, their potential unrealized, their futures stolen by a man who valued his freedom and his wealth more than their lives. And yet, paradoxically, some people still admire Pablo Escobar. In certain neighborhoods in Medellin, you can find murals of his face, T-shirts with his image, bars and restaurants that trade on his notoriety. Tourists take Pablo Escobar tours that visit his former properties, that tell sanitized stories about his life, that downplay the violence and emphasize the mythology. This commodification of evil, this transformation of a terrorist into a tourist attraction, is deeply troubling. It suggests that society has not fully reckoned with what Pablo represented, that the allure of his wealth and power still blinds some to the ocean of blood he spilled to acquire them. The appropriate legacy for Pablo Escobar is not admiration or nostalgia or fascination. It is revulsion. It is sorrow. It is a determination to never allow such a figure to rise again. His story is not one of success or triumph. It is a story of colossal waste, of human potential directed toward destruction, of intelligence and ambition placed in service of greed and violence. He was not a hero. He was not a genius. He was a criminal who killed thousands of people in pursuit of wealth and power, and when he died on that rooftop, the world became a marginally better place, even though his death solved none of the underlying problems that had enabled his rise. If Pablo Escobar's life teaches anything, it is this: that money without morality is meaningless, that power without principle is poison, that fame built on corpses is infamy, not glory. He had everything that popular culture tells us to value: wealth, power, control, the ability to bend the world to his will. And in the end, he died alone and hunted, surrounded by enemies, separated from his family, his empire in ruins, his name synonymous with terror rather than triumph. He lived 44 years, most of them consumed by violence and paranoia, and he died violently, his blood staining a rooftop in the city where he had once believed himself untouchable. There is a photograph taken in Medellin many years after Pablo's death. It shows children playing soccer on one of the fields he built, running and laughing in the afternoon sun, unaware of or unconcerned with the history of the ground beneath their feet. In some ways, this image captures the complexity of Pablo's legacy better than any analysis. The field exists. The children benefit from it. But the field was built with blood money by a man who cared nothing for children except as potential recruits for his Sicario armies. The good he did was so small compared to the harm, so tainted by its source, that it cannot redeem or justify or explain away the horror of his life. Colombia continues to heal, to build, to move forward. The violence of the cartel era has decreased significantly, though challenges remain. The peace agreement with FARC, signed in 2016, offers hope for a future where conflict does not define the nation. Young Colombians, those born after Pablo's death, are creating new narratives for their country. Narratives about culture and innovation and resilience rather than drugs and violence. They want the world to see Colombia as more than the country that produced Pablo Escobar, and they are working to make that vision real. In the end, Pablo Escobar's legacy is ashes. The mansions have been demolished, the money is gone, the empire has crumbled. The hippos remain, invasive and destructive, perhaps the most fitting symbol of what he left behind. A problem that outlives its creator, that cannot be easily solved, that harms the ecosystem it inhabits. His children have changed their names, seeking distance from his crimes. His memory is contested, some remembering him with fondness, more remembering him with horror, and the argument over which memory is true reveals how difficult it is for societies to process their own darkest chapters. The boy from Envigado who dreamed of wealth and power achieved both beyond measure. But the price he paid, and more importantly, the price he forced others to pay, was so catastrophic that his life stands as one of history's great cautionary tales. He was not special. He was not unique. He was simply a man who chose violence when other options existed, who chose greed when restraint was possible, who chose to break the world rather than fix it. And when the world he broke finally broke him, it was justice, however belated, however incomplete. On that rooftop in Los Olivos, on December 2nd, 1993, something ended. Not the drug trade, not violence, not corruption, but one man's reign of terror, one man's belief that he was above all consequences, one man's war against reality itself. Pablo Escobar fell on those red tiles under the Colombian sun, and in his falling, he proved what should never have needed proof: that no empire built on blood can last, that no amount of money can purchase immunity from justice, that every tyrant, no matter how powerful, eventually meets the reckoning they have earned. The ashes of his legacy scatter in the wind. The memory of his victims endures. And Colombia, battered but unbroken, continues its long journey toward healing, carrying the scars of the Pablo Escobar era as a reminder of what must never happen again. The king of cocaine is dead. The kingdom he built has turned to dust, and the only throne he occupies now is in the nightmares of a nation that he terrorized, a monument to the terrible truth that power without conscience destroys everything it touches, including the man who wields it.